Welcome to Rehash, a Web3 podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and today we're speaking with Parker Jay-Pachirat, head of community at Fintech Collective's crypto fund and a founding member of Boys Club. We'll be chatting all about power structures and design systems in DAOs, getting into crypto investment from a humanities background, and some ethical issues surrounding technological advancements like blockchain tech. But before we dive into our conversation with Parker, here's a quick word from the Web3 projects that helped make the season possible.
Web2 Social has become a world of walled gardens, where platforms own your data, your content, and your community.
But Lens Protocol is a community garden, a user-owned, composable, and decentralized ecosystem designed to let Web3 social apps bloom.
When you create content on Lens, you own it, you control it, you take it with you from app to app, and you decide how it's monetized. Instead of chasing ads and algorithms, you set the value of your work, and your community collects it directly from you. Here at Rehash, we'll be experimenting with this ourselves by posting all content from Season 3 on Lens, where our community can now truly interact and grow with us. So bring your photos and videos, your GMs, and your friends, and come join the new era of social media on Lens Protocol.
Go to claim.lens.xyz to claim the last social media handle you'll ever need. And be sure to follow rehash.lens.
Contributing to a DAO can feel like this. Contributing to several DAOs can feel like this. But it doesn't have to. With Avenue, you can filter out the noise, get to know more DAOs, and start contributing right away. Avenue allows contributors to form organic teams to work together on the things they love. This means DAOs can operate, coordinate, and collaborate at a scale that used to be impossible. Because working together in a DAO should be like making music. The drummers drum, the singers sing, and when collaboration leads the way, a song emerges. No more relying on the core team to get things done. It's time to get your community contributing. To give your DAO the information they need to know, the tools they need to self-organize, and the spaces they need to work together, visit avenue.place.
Hey guys, thanks for hopping on here. I just wanted to touch base real quick.
What's up, Diane?
What's up? So first of all, I just wanted to say thanks, Tyler, for taking these meeting notes. They look great.
I didn't take those. I'll take credit for it, though.
Wait, that wasn't you? Do we know who it was? And who's been posting those hilarious meme videos on our Twitter?
Oh, I have no idea. There's a lot going on here, though. Like, how are we supposed to keep up with what everyone's doing?
I don't know. It feels like pure chaos being in a DAO sometimes. Ellie, what was that thing you were talking about that helps DAO contributors add and organize all of their contributions?
Oh yeah, it's called Govern. It's like GitHub for DAO contributors.
Ooh, that sounds cool. How does it actually work?
Yeah, so it's actually a protocol where DAO members can add any task they've completed as a contribution. And then their fellow DAO members can attest to them to confirm that those contributions were valid without the need for a core team to do so. What you end up with is a simple bottom-up way for members to build out the DAO's contribution graph themselves. It gives contributors more power and freedom. It makes it a lot easier to accurately reward everyone. DAO members actually own all of their contributions, so if they want to jump into another DAO, they can actually prove they know their stuff.
Okay, I'm sold. Can it be on chain?
Of course, but on Gnosis chain, so transactions are super cheap.
Ooh. All right, yeah, I'm down. Diane?
Yeah, for sure. Let's set it up. What's the link, Ellie?
Just go to govern.app, and that's govern without the E, so GOVRN.app.
Perfect. All right, well, if you guys got this, I got to jump back to another call. Hey, Parker, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm so good, and it's been such a long time coming, so I'm super excited to be here today.
Such a long time coming. I think I first met you through a Twitter Spaces that LDF hosted and we were both on, and then we've just been instant Twitter buddies, and I'm so happy that the community voted you on to come on this season of the podcast, and now here we are. There's so much I want to talk to you about, so let's just go ahead and dive right on in. But for anybody who isn't familiar with who you are, can you start off just by telling us a little bit about your background and how you got into crypto from a general humanities background?
For sure, yeah. I'll start with the present day. So, as you just mentioned, I am on the investment team at Fintech Collective's DeFi fund, where I have a specialized focus on helping our founders build, scale, and design their communities. Fintech Collective has been around since 2012. We've been investing in DeFi since before it had a name. And we're first check into protocols like MakerDAO, Centrifuge, UMA, NiDig, Rainbow Wallet, etc. So that's been awesome, super fun. And I'm lucky to work with great founders and a great team. I'm also on the founding team of Boys Club, a social club, DAO, and community, helping women and non-binary individuals in crypto build, and also driving a new kind of culture in this space. I would say I had a pretty untraditional path to this industry and to tech in general. All my life, I grew up in a very non-tech environment, honestly, a very academic environment. And I went to a small liberal arts school, knowing that I was into tech. For some reason, though, I ended up falling down a rabbit hole of reading about emergent tech, bleeding edge tech, AI, brain machine interfaces, and it really clicked for me. I've always been super excited about the future, super excited about thinking about what's next, and also really interested in social issues, social change, social mobilization. So I saw a lot of connection between sort of what I was studying in my major, critical theory, and the opportunity that I saw tech present to create better systems in the world. I started working with an early stage VC, did some startup work, and I had known about crypto for a bit, but my light bulb moment really happened when I was looking deeper into what blockchain is and what it can enable. And that's when I really realized, just like AI, just like the World Wide Web, just like computing, blockchain is a technology that has the potential to fundamentally reimagine so many parts of our world, how we work, how we play, how we coordinate value, how we exchange value. And that's what got me really excited about it, was seeing not just the applications of blockchain to finance, but also the disruptive potential that it brought to everything from supply chains and manufacturing to data sharing and privacy.
That is a fascinating background. I want to unpack a lot of that. The first is, you mentioned back in university, you studied something called critical theory, which I think a lot of people listening probably won't be familiar with because it's not a very common major that we see in universities. And I've heard you describe critical theory as, at least at your university, as having this overarching aim to sort of uncover systems of power that are typically taken for granted, and also to, sort of develop these students who can create social change, like you said. So on that note, when we're thinking about systems of power, when you think about the Web3 ecosystem more broadly, and then also honing in more specifically to DAOs, since you're pretty involved in a number of DAOs, Boys Club being the first and foremost, what systems of power can you identify in the Web3 space and in DAOs more specifically as it stands today?
That's a really good question. And I think there are a lot of different ways I could answer it. But what first comes to mind is something that I've been recently thinking about. There's this prevailing idea in crypto, and especially within the DAO space, that code is law and protocol is law. But I actually think a lot is disregarded by making an assumptive statement like that, right? That doesn't account for all of the soft power that exists and all of the soft power dynamics that exist, doesn't account for the personal relationships and friendships and after hours text messages and calls and private calls that go into ultimately decision making, right, within different DAOs. And we saw this, as a first example in the early Bitcoin community. So I think that's something that isn't given enough consideration. At the same time, I think that's a very natural part of, I guess, human instincts and human behavior, is to, find your tribe. And I don't necessarily think we should optimize around that for DAO members, for example, to have zero outside interaction, to try to keep the voting process like pure or only on chain. But rather, I think we should maybe start thinking about how can we integrate delegation off-chain forms of governance into a process that also includes maybe on-chain voting and governance, and what might a balance look like?
In your mind, I'm curious, what does that balance look like to you? Because I think the off-chain delegation or the off-chain influence that we see a lot of today comes from all of the social capital that people have built from building an audience on Twitter, for example, or going to conferences, meeting people. It's a lot of that. And while some of that has a basis, a lot of the times it maybe doesn't have as strong of a basis as it maybe should. And I guess what I mean by that is just you see some people on crypto Twitter with hundreds of thousands of followers who pretty much have the ability to say whatever they want, whether it's true or false, whether it's productive or whether it brings people down. It doesn't really matter. And everybody will rally behind them and jump on just because they've built that social capital. And so when you talk about this off-chain influence that people should be able to have, I guess, like, where do you see that influence coming from, or where should it come from, and how should that play out in practice?
It's a great question. I think starting from a higher level, and I'll circle back and touch into that point as well, but I think there's a lot of problems in DAO governance today, like you're saying, with one or very few actors in the system having the power to completely sway votes, oftentimes just on a means of their financial privilege or on a means of social capital, right? Which is a bit harder to, I think, quantify, measure, and define. I think there's an urgent call to action, which is to move away from token-based voting. And I don't think that necessarily we should just stop using it completely in all situations, but I think there's a lot more design space there to be explored. And I also think it's a worthy consideration of doing some pattern matching, right? Like, what are some of the biggest issues that we're seeing in DAOs or have seen recently in DAOs so far, right? We are seeing in token-based governance models, one or two whales swaying the vote in a way that actually goes completely against what the majority of the community has expressed a preference for. So I think that's pretty problematic. I think some potential issues as well, like, were highlighted in the recent situation with Mango, where a voter and a governance participant, DAO participant, essentially just followed the governance protocol in a smart way, in a clever way, and was able to basically like heist the DAO. And that wasn't a technical failure. That wasn't a technical hack. That was literally by design. So I think this is an urgent wake-up call for DAOs to begin exploring alternate models of governance and voting within DAOs. One thing that I think is interesting that we'll see as well too is we'll begin to explore the sort of case study of what happens when a big DAO tries to change their governance mechanism and they're already far along, they're already established. So moving away from token-based voting, I think, is one way that we can create more accountability, create more representation of diversity of thought and opinion and autonomy, and actually empower DAO members and contributors to achieve their goals in a more efficient way. I think a second thing that I'm really excited about is anonymous voting. I think there are pros and cons here. I'm like, why not? Let's explore it. I think I saw at a recent hackathon, someone built this using zero knowledge proofs, which was super exciting. And I think that's really important too. Like, there are many votes where I think the participants voting and the social power they have, the social capital they have, really does influence the rest of the DAO. And if you almost even think about it within the system of the DAO itself, it's like, if you're a contributor and you want to gain more responsibility, gain more power, gain votes for maybe an upcoming election that you're going to be in from certain people, you are incentivized to participate in a way that's favorable to them. And I think it'll be really interesting to see more experimentation and implementation of anonymous voting mechanisms as they arise. The third thing that I think we should also be paying attention to is, what are the touch points of the decision-making process, of the governance process? This is something that we quickly realized we needed the first DAO proposal that we ran within Boys Club. It was super emotional and crazy, and it was super fun, but it was absolute chaos. And like one thing we realized, like we need to have a call to pitch our ideas, to discuss them before we dive into the actual vote itself. And I think that's a very valuable way of making people feel seen and heard as well, which is extremely important for retention.
Yeah, I think all three of those are really good points. The anonymous voting thing is something I've thought about a lot, and I kind of have gone back and forth with myself on it so many times, like evaluating the pros and cons. For instance, just the other day, I was looking through some of the proposals of a DAO that I'm part of, and I read through one of the proposals. I was ready to vote no on it. I like truly believed, I like didn't stand for it. And then I clicked into it to vote, and I saw that over 100 people had already voted yes, and that nobody had voted no. And so at that point, like seeing that, I wasn't about to vote no and like be the only person. So at that point, I just refrained from voting, and this proposal passed, but it's not something that I would have voted for. And as a member of the DAO, like I should have my voice heard, but in that moment, I didn't feel like I could. That's kind of a situation where anonymous voting would play a role. But then I sort of thought about it and I was like, maybe these people all know something that I don't know. And that's why they're voting yes on this. And maybe they're right. Like I don't know. I like sort of talked myself then into believing that I do support this proposal or that I should support this proposal. And I wonder like where the truth lies, I guess, like probably lies somewhere in between the two, where maybe I don't understand as much as other people who are more involved in the space and the DAOs specifically understand. But at the same time, there should be some mechanism for me to still have my voice heard or to ask the questions that I wanted to ask in order to better understand the proposal.
100%. And I think what you just described is extremely common, right? Like tragedy of the commons. This happens with the whale votes too, right? So like the whales will obviously influence the entire vote, oftentimes against the preferences of the strong majority of the DAO. And that leads people to have voting fatigue, right? Like you just said, it was a little bit of a different situation for you, but like feeling like your vote isn't going to matter, like be able to make a change dissuades you from voting altogether. One other like idea and thing that I've sort of been thinking about is not just anonymous votes, but like the outcome or sort of score of the vote until it's closed is anonymous, is private. Like I think that would change a lot. And I'm really excited to see more experimentation with that. I think whether it ends up being good or bad, probably both will happen from it, but like we'll learn a lot. And another point as well, I think like right now in the DAO space or in sort of the crypto discourse, at least on my timeline, I've been seeing a lot of rejection of DAOs and a lot of like pointing to certain, maybe scaling or roadmap issues or vision alignment issues that DAOs are having. People are pointing to this and saying DAOs don't work as a business model. And I'm trying to say, we don't know that yet. Actually, one thing that we can observe is like many of these DAOs that people are pointing to as failures and as case studies for why DAOs don't work are all failing because of token voting. At least that's what I think. So I think there's like an urgent call to action, like I said before, to begin to widen our sort of mental model of like what a DAO is, what governance is, what it can be, and put more research and experimentation into playing around with new ways of doing things.
I definitely want to dive into that more a little later on when we talk about your experience with investing in Web3 startups and what your thoughts are on investing in DAOs as well. I think that's super relevant. But while we're still on this topic of power structures and systems of power within DAOs, I guess if you were to design your perfect DAO, now that we've uncovered some of the challenges that we've seen with DAOs already, what would that power structure, power dynamic, hierarchy, if you will, look like in an ideal DAO? Like, how many layers of power should there be? How many people should have each layer of power? Who should those people be that have each layer of power? Like, how transitory should that power be in terms of like being able to be passed from person to person or taken away from people who might choose to abuse it? I'd love to hear your thoughts on like what that ideal situation looks like in your mind.
That's a great question. And you're asking all the questions that I think about 24/7 and that keep me up at night. So, yeah, a lot of different thoughts here. I mean, I think to start, I'll make a disclaimer and say that I don't think there's one right way to do DAOs. I think if I were to make an assertion that there's one way of doing or designing a DAO that would be better for all DAOs to adopt, I think that would be incorrect. I think different DAOs have different needs, right? Obviously, they have different purposes. Some are investment DAOs, some are social DAOs, some are hobbyist DAOs. And those different needs and different purposes for uniting and goals require different strategies for achievement, right? There's also like the factor of time. How long do you want this DAO to be a DAO? Eternally? Is it a flash DAO? Is it mobilized for a specific purpose or goal of achievement that is rooted in periodic context, right? Like maybe Constitution DAO or Ukraine DAO. Those DAOs have very different needs than DAOs that I would say are a bit more ephemeral, or who I sort of perceive as trying to be a bit more ephemeral, right? So I don't think it's a one size fits all. I think it's like very much not a one size fits all. And I think it's a little bit reductionist to think there's one framework that works for everyone. That said, for my ideal DAO, I think this is a little bit of a hard question for me to answer. And the reason is I think about DAOs a lot, obviously, within the context of Boys Club. So to provide some background there, I'm on the founding team. I'm primarily responsible and have been basically since I joined for leading the design and execution of Boys Club DAO. So creating the DAO, designing the DAO, implementing these processes. And my journey throughout that has been really different than I thought it would be. Like my process has been really different than I thought it would be when I first set out to do it. I think now it's month 11, actually. That's pretty crazy. But yeah, it's taken a lot longer than I thought. It's because I do really believe that there's not one right way to design a DAO. So I guess zooming out of the governance piece a little bit, because I want to sort of provide a framework of like how I think about DAO building generally, is like there's all these different puzzle pieces, right? And, you know, there's the puzzle piece of your treasury, composure, makeup, diversification strategies, allocation. There's the puzzle piece of governance design, right? Like what you're saying, like how do people vote? How is voting power distributed? There's organizational design, right? Like how are the teams or factions within the DAO designed? So there's all these different puzzle pieces. And sometimes I just feel like DAO building is world building and also game design, because you're trying to make all these pieces function really well. You're also optimizing and tailoring each one, or at least I am, for the kind of culture or outcome that you want to see within the DAO itself. And then you're thinking about, okay, how do I make these systems not only function autonomously on their own and lack severe dependencies that could be existential threats, but how do I make them work together in a way where they work in a cycle of mutual constitution and are providing positive feedback loops to strengthen each other? And then you add in the layer of the actual humans and participants, which is like when it gets really fun, and think about the humans within all of these different systems within the DAO. So you're basically trying to create, or I'm trying to create, positive sum games, and positive sum games that work as reinforcing points for each other and for the entire system as a whole.
I know most of your work that you've done with DAOs has been with Boys Club. And as a founding member of Boys Club, like you were primarily in charge of creating a DAO around Boys Club, or turning Boys Club into a DAO, because it didn't start out as a DAO from day one. I should also say here that we did have the founders of Boys Club, Dina Burke and Natasha Hoskins, on the podcast. It was season 2, episode 12. So if you want to pause here as you're listening and go back and listen to the episode with Dina and Natasha, so you can learn more about Boys Club before continuing to listen to Parker talk about the DAO side of Boys Club, feel free to do that. But I would love to hear how you have been able to apply some of that thinking that you just described to Boys Club specifically, and what solutions you found to be the most successful in Boys Club.
Yeah. So the sort of framework for thinking about DAO building and all of these different puzzle pieces from more of like a macro lens, like how would an alien look at this? A smart alien, hopefully. All of that actually came from my experience over the past 11 months. So I didn't go into wanting to build the DAO and wanting to pioneer this initiative with this sort of framework in mind. It really emerged as kind of a learning across the process. And I can sort of walk you through what that was like, because I think there's been a lot of learnings there for me as well when I'm like helping my founders or portfolio companies or friends think about their own DAOs, right? So when I started like going out into the internet to do research about, what is it out? Like, what are the different components that I need to account for, design for? Like, we know the characteristics of DAOs, I'd say pretty generally, but there's all these intricacies that come into play. And at least 11 months ago, there was no one place where all this was like consolidated and documented, right? You have a million things to think about, and any change in the system or to one part of the system really affects the rest of the system. So it's like delicately putting together all of these parts in a way that strengthens the whole. But my first sort of phase of the process was research. I thought this was going to take me 1 to 2, maybe 3 months. It took me about 6 or 7 months, I would say, to feel comfortable, ready to actually go in and not just identify the systems I needed to create and design for, but B, like have an educated understanding of the way to design those systems in a way that optimizes for our community at Boys Club and what we're trying to achieve. So after I felt like I had a substantial understanding of all the different aspects of what a DAO is, and also many of the different options for each of those puzzle pieces and how to design them, I wanted to try to design like a MVP, and this is where we're at now, of minimum viable community DAO. So what are the minimum tools we need and minimum amount of contributors we need to get like a decentralized or somewhat decentralized governance structure and proposal process, amongst other things, off the ground. I think this will continue to evolve over time. One thing that I think people might be surprised about is right now, we don't use Snapchat or anything like that for voting. We use Discord emoji reactions. And the reason for this is because we wanted to really make sure that our contributors were educated, informed, and that they really just had the muscle memory of understanding how to submit a proposal, when to submit a proposal, where to submit it, how to vote, how to participate in feedback, and all that before we moved that on chain. And sort of we're taking a similar approach and process to other aspects of the DAO as well. But I'd say to sort of summarize and recap the process so far has been number one, research, which took a lot of time. Then after gaining an understanding of the different components of a DAO and the different options for each of those components, beginning to try to design each of those systems myself. So governance, treasury allocation, treasury management, etc. And then actually implementation, which I thought was going to be like the last 20%. But a big learning has actually been, I think there's going to be a lot more work that's needed to be done to solve for this issue of the DAO design process and then implementation process, especially if you already have all of these contributors, because we want their feedback. We want to know this works for them. We want to make sure before we fully move to a tool or a set of tools to reinforce these systems that we've created, that the system itself actually works. So that's sort of the process we're in now. It's like gathering feedback. We're in our MVC stage, and it's been really fun.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think every DAO that has been around for more than 6 months or a year has gone through that process that you guys have gone through with, trying to build this like MVP or MVC, as you call it, and then just getting user feedback and seeing what the community likes about it, what it doesn't like, and then making improvements from there. And I think, it's like you said, every DAO is different. And so there isn't a playbook that applies to every DAO. And you can't really skip over that process of getting feedback from your community, your specific community and your specific DAO, and making improvements accordingly there. So that makes a ton of sense to me. I do want to shift gears a little bit and talk about investor side of Parker, because there's this like boys club, like DAO girl Parker, and then there's this investor Parker. And you kind of have an interesting background because you studied humanities in university, and then straight out of that, you started working in venture capital, first at a Web2 venture capital firm, and now you're obviously working on the crypto fund at Fintech Collective. So I'm curious, just for background, how did you get into VC work from a humanities background?
Such a great question. So I learned about VC through working at a startup. And like I said before, I've always been obsessed with the future, obsessed with thinking about what's next, and literally get butterflies in my stomach thinking about bleeding edge technology and the way that it might change the world. So I didn't realize that at the time, but I think pretty obviously that maps well onto sort of the work of an early stage investor. I also love working with founders. I had a great experience at the last startup I was at as chief of staff, and I got to work very closely with my CEO as kind of a thought partner, thinking about new initiatives, strategy, how to scale the company, and all of that. And that was really gratifying, exciting work for me. So I think, there's also a bit of that mapped on as well too, is this operator side of me that loves getting in the weeds and thinking about strategy and working with founders that I feel really lucky to do every day. But to go back to your question, sort of what is the connection between humanities and VC, if there is one, and how did I sort of make that jump? I worked really hard to get my foot in the door. And that was the hardest part. Like, it was a struggle. Like I said, I went to a liberal arts school. My major, critical theory, is literally only offered at that school. So it's like a really weird and unique major. And I didn't have, experience or formal training or formal background in finance. I don't even know if that was like offered at my school. So there were all these sort of touch points of, other sort of people and candidates that I was researching and comparing myself to, and really feeling like I don't fit this sort of profile. I also think VC is very much, as many industries are, like a relationship business. And there are certain things that many firms are looking for, whether that's like a business degree or, knows finance and stuff like that. But what I did is I just read a bunch of theses, right? So like I was like online reading like my favorite investors' theses about what they were investing in. How do they think about VC? How do they think about startups? How do they think about scaling? And then also talking to a lot of VCs. I feel extremely grateful because I did so much cold outreach during college. I had this like spreadsheet. I was like in my junior year of school, I literally had a spreadsheet, and I had an amazing mentor, Alexander Keat, who I have to thank for like pushing me to actually like make these systems and be diligent, but had a spreadsheet of all the people I wanted to talk to, like who are they, what fund do they work at, what stage, what do I want to ask them about their specific experience or like things that they've invested in. And when I say I feel really lucky because like my response rate to cold outreach was so high. And, I'm just this girl in this liberal arts school with like no background in VC, no background in finance. Like, that's just like, I'm so excited about this. And I have a bunch of questions to ask you. And VCs are really busy. Like, some people don't think they are, but they are. And having all these people like being willing to talk to me, and not just willing to talk to me, but like who would follow up with me and be like, hey, like, check out this opportunity, check out this opportunity. I'd love to give a shout out to someone actually, Catherine Wu. I feel like she really, really believed in me in a way that was honestly pretty transformative. And there were many times when I was going through this process trying to get my foot in the door where I felt like giving up and I felt like imposter syndrome. And she always said to me, like, all you need is one yes, and then you're going to like kill it. You're going to like be able to prove yourself. And her like faith in me was like unwavering. And that was just like really awesome and made me feel empowered and made me feel capable and made me feel like, okay, wow, like this person who knows so much about this and who I respect so greatly wants to help me and believes in me. And so like, I hope I can give that back to like other people one day as well. But the last thing I'll say here is I was working at an early stage VC, a Novus Asset Management in college. They do alternate protein investments. So everything from Beyond Meat to cellular meat, lab grown meat, biotech. And I loved that experience. And one thing that I noticed then and that I continue to notice today in my work at Fintech Collective is there's a lot of analytical work in VC that I love. Like I love researching. I love going deep. I love writing investment memos and making a thesis and researching a space and trying to identify what I believe or predict will be true. Like where's the puck going? How can we follow it? What kind of collage of portfolios and changes in the world do we want to see? And then finding the evidence to back that up, right? And proving it. Why is this the right team? Why is this the right founder? Why is this the right time? Why is this the right way of going about it? And then also like the relationship side. Like I love people. I love discussions. I love talking to people. And so obviously that's a huge part of this work as well that I really enjoy.
What a cool story. I mean, I know you said many times, you got lucky with this, you got lucky with that, but it sounds like you definitely put in the work as well. And have to shout out Catherine as well. She is just an amazing human being. She was on the podcast before. Yeah, she's a super cool person. And I love her new podcast too. So Cross-Chain Examination, people should go listen to that. But so I was going to ask you, you said back when you were in college still and you were reaching out to all these VCs to learn more about what it's like to be an investor, you had studied all of these investors' investment theses. I'm wondering what your investment thesis is now with regards to crypto or DeFi specifically, what you do in your job at Fintech Collective, and maybe how that compares to some of the investment theses that you studied from people that you really respect back in the day.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll speak in terms of what I'm really excited about right now. I don't want to speak on behalf of the rest of my team, but there are two kind of areas and spaces that I'm super excited about. One obviously is governance and governance design. This is less of an investment thesis, but I think it really influences the kind of direction that we're heading with some of the biggest DeFi protocols and DAOs in the space. And in turn will kind of shape the future of the industry. So I think it's important to pay attention to. And then also, weirdly enough, I'm non-technical, which was always a really big insecurity of mine. For a while, I was working as a product manager for a tech startup, and that was just a big insecurity of mine, is not being a technical PM. And I still kind of feel that way sometimes, like in crypto. But that said, I got really into zero knowledge proofs and rollups and have gone super deep into that space. I'm really excited about it. I think zero knowledge rollups are the most viable solution for scaling Ethereum. I also think there's a lot of super exciting potential to be unlocked with zero knowledge powered apps and dApps, as well as zero knowledge powered blockchains and protocols. And I think that's something that we haven't really talked as much about within the space, or even within like the ZK community. I think we hear at this point a lot more about rollups, but there's a lot of progress being made on the zero knowledge sort of app front that's making it much easier and much more accessible to create your own zero knowledge powered app. So I think we're going to see like a huge plethora of use cases from this. And, it's going to allow us to do things like anonymous voting in DAOs. It's going to allow people to do things like prove their credit score, maybe, new ways of doing KYC where people can prove their credit score or prove certain information is true without actually revealing what it is, which I think solves for some of the fundamental questions and tensions with onboarding like institutions and enterprises, and sort of the question of censorship and privacy within crypto. So zero knowledge, yeah, all the way.
Yeah, that's something that for anybody who isn't familiar with zero knowledge proofs, you might see it on Twitter, people calling it ZK proofs or ZKP. I have seen some more technical content creators lately start creating a lot more content surrounding what ZK proofs are. And I know I just saw a video by Gary Shane that I thought explained it super well and like very layman terms that any non-technical person could understand. And Albert, that guy in tech, has been a great resource for me too, to learn more about the technical side of things in an easy to understand way. So definitely I would encourage you to go and Google more or go on YouTube and watch some videos or go on Twitter and try to learn more about ZK proofs. I think that's going to be a big thing coming up. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, because I know that your title is like the head of community at Fintech Collective's crypto fund. I'm wondering, in this space specifically, from what you've seen, I think community building and marketing and content oftentimes are very closely tied together. And even myself, like I've said, on Twitter or on podcasts I've been on, that even though I come from more of like a content or marketing background, it wasn't until I got into the Web3 space that I started getting interested in community building, because I started to see how closely tied community building is to content and marketing. But I've also heard you say that community building and marketing are not the same thing, and that there's an important distinction between the two. So could you sort of explain what you mean by that?
Definitely. So I think it's a spectrum, but I think it's a really important distinction to make. I think it really also depends, like how much crossover and blend, sort of how blurry the lines are, also really depend on the stage you're at of like your company or community building process. So community versus marketing. Community is like a very fluffy term. I feel like that's thrown around, and I think sometimes is not taken that seriously. And while I can understand why, I think, like you said, especially in crypto, community is absolutely crucial. If you do community right, whether it's in crypto or whether it's in Web 2, it will be a 10 times leverager across every single area of your business: marketing, growth, token price, right? And when we think about these decentralized communities, so not even things that are necessarily native as DAOs, but that have DAOs and use DAOs to function, right? So think of some of the biggest DeFi protocols in the space. What's super important to making those systems healthy, flourish, progress? It's having participation, having engagement, feeling actively a part of the community and welcomed, and having the resources and context that you need to contribute, right? But I think where a lot of people kind of maybe go wrong, where the biggest distinction for me is that marketing you can create and you can buy, right? Community, you can buy bots, you can buy followers. I don't know what else you can buy, probably more than that. But you can't buy a real community, right? You can't pay people to stick around. You can't pay people to actually engage thoughtfully in your Discord and participate and want to contribute. And you can't pay for ownership, right? Which I think is sort of the end goal. And once you have ownership in a community, you can do basically anything. And you and your company and your DAO or whatever you're building, whatever the community is behind, becomes an absolute superpower.
Yeah, that's a really interesting distinction, that the notion that you can't buy community, like no matter what, I think is super important. And that is what makes community the moat in Web3. And the thing that really makes Web3 startups and DAOs either succeed or fail is really like that genuine community part. Last thing I want to ask you, again, going back to what you studied in university, critical theory. I know we keep going back to this and it's like you've moved past it, but it's just so interesting. I know something that you focused on within your major was what you call post-humanism, this idea that humanity can be transformed, transcended, or eliminated by technological advances. And I think, when we think about technological advances, most people listening to this podcast are probably very pro tech advances and cutting edge technology. But of course, as most of us have seen the show Black Mirror on Netflix, like there is a dark side to technological advances as well. And so when you think about the ethics of technological advancements, are there any ethical concerns that you might have as you think about advancing technology, especially in the space of blockchain tech?
It's a great question. I had an answer for brain machine interfaces, actually. I think it could apply, though, to crypto too. So I'll start there. So I am a huge fan of Nick Bostrom. I love his work. I hope to be a posthuman one day. I'll probably be getting Neuralink V4 or 5, hopefully. It's always excited me. And I love tech. And it's also one of my theses that this is sort of a natural next step, right? Like if we look at the evolution of the way that we interact with tech in our daily lives, we started out with desktop computers that were basically reserved for scientists, the military. And at that time, they were actually portrayed to society as something to be feared, like these soulless machines. Eventually, they were adopted in offices. People got more used to using them. So they got smaller. People started bringing them home as laptops. The sort of interface got even smaller, and it continues to get smaller, right? We can think of iPad, iPhone, etc., until you reach a point in which the functional purpose of the device doesn't work because the interface is too small. And that's what we saw with Apple Watches. And at that point, that's your inflection point, right? That's where the next thing is, which I strongly believe will be brain machine interfaces. Specifically within what I was studying in the sort of research project that I designed for myself was how recreational adoption of brain machine interfaces, or BMIs, will change the way that we define ability and disability in our society. So over time, the definition of disability has actually evolved a lot. In the very olden days, you'd only be considered to have a disability if you were like a soldier in war that specifically lost a limb. Obviously now, the definition encapsulates way more. But I think there's this really interesting question of, will we have a post-human kind of apartheid when we see this mass adoption, right? Because then you're going to have basically this new kind of race of people with Neuralink, with brain machine interfaces, and those that don't. And I think it's going to be a very ideological divide, but also sort of change how we view human limitation. So I think what's really important there, and sort of the point that I think carries over to crypto as well, is number one, providing access is really important, right? So how do we get crypto not just in the hands of the Western world, but emerging markets, developing countries? And we're actually seeing, I think, crypto being used, and the real world value and real world value capture of crypto is happening every single day in these countries. I remember reading a month or two ago in Nigeria, people are sort of switching to stablecoins because their local currency has been so volatile and changed so many times. And so the real use case is there. But if we don't make an active effort to do the research necessary on how we can bring blockchain, its applications, and crypto and its applications to those communities in a way that is actually beneficial to them, we will fail greatly, and those people will not adopt this tech. And within brain machine interfaces, just to tie that back very quickly, one anecdote would be there were a bunch of really interesting studies I looked at that sort of looked at what brain machine interface companies, specifically on the medical side, so BMI tech to help with spinal injuries, seizures, stuff like that, what companies were designing for, and then an actual qualitative and quantitative review of the populations of people that could and wanted to use these technologies for their sort of physical impairment or health issue. And what they found is the things that people wanted to use the brain machine interfaces for had nothing to do with what the actual companies were designing for. So in that case, right, we're seeing across the board and at scale a severe lack of user research, which is frankly extremely alarming, and also completely misses the potential to create that opportunity and to realize it. So I think that's important in crypto as well, right? Doing a lot of research on what communities, especially marginalized communities and underserved communities, actually want and need to use the technology for, versus what maybe from an outsider or different perspective we think they might want to use it for.
Totally. Yeah. Again, not to go down this whole other rabbit hole, but that's why diversity is so important to emphasize. in the space, because we'll never know what marginalized groups want and need or care about unless we talk to them, unless we have them in our community as not just members, but decision makers, so that they not only have a voice, but we can make sure that they're actually heard and that they get to be part of that decision-making process.
I think that is like one kind of meta opportunity in crypto and blockchain that is so, can I curse on here?
Yeah.
Okay. Just checking. It's so fucking exciting. Like, think about the technologies that I kind of compared blockchain to before, right? As these like massive inflection points where when these technologies were coming out, we had no idea what they would be used for. We had no idea the internet would bring about YouTube and online marketplaces and e-com, etc. The same is like happening in crypto right now. Like, we're still in that emergent phase and we have no idea, I think, what it will be used for. The difference is sort of, situating this in like a social context with like the World Wide Web, with computing, with AI, like all of those emergent fields. Most people didn't have an opportunity to participate in that when it was being formed. And I think crypto right now presents an amazing opportunity and an urgent opportunity to, like you said, get a very diverse group of people involved in the design and actual creation and building of this thing from the ground up in a way that is, I think, going to go down in history. And it's exciting to see. So I'm super bullish on the space and just like excited to be a part of it and excited to be talking to you today. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, of course. So I try to wrap up every episode with a few just quick, fun, rapid fire questions. So first question I have for you is, you get to rebrand one thing in Web3 and it's guaranteed to stick. What do you rebrand?
Okay. Oh my God. Okay. I would rebrand protocols or DAOs or any project that is launching a token to try to support or bolster the product or as a marketing kind of initiative. I would rebrand that as a scam.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a pretty hot take.
Is it? I don't know. I mean, maybe it is, but I can give a little more rationale. I don't think everyone launching a token is a scam at all. Bullish tokens, but I do think, a sort of common theme that we've been talking about during this conversation as well is like thinking from the system design ground up. And I think, like, at least for me, I've seen a lot of projects either be pressured, maybe even like by VCs to launch tokens or by their teams to launch tokens when they haven't even reached product market fit. And like a token has nothing to do with like the sort of purpose or utility or use case of the product. And so I think like, if you're launching a token to try to make your product work, but your product doesn't really have to do with the token, or like you're trying to launch a token to gain attention and users and sort of as a marketing initiative, that probably means like your fundamental principles and design systems like aren't strong enough, or like maybe you need to reconsider them in a different way. I also think I would rebrand a lot of emphasis on this idea that DAO tools are going to fix the problems in DAOs. I reject that. I think we need to actually have a much more intentional and investigative and critical approach and view and look into the underlying design. Like I said, like the governance, the token voting mechanisms, all of that. But these tools on top are sort of like band-aid solutions. Like the underlying system design is never going to be fixed or work sustainably with better tools on top.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I'm actually curious to hear your thoughts on how this applies beyond DAOs or protocols or like product-based projects. I guess like what I'm referencing is, I don't know if you saw, Legion just published an article called The New Creator Playbook, Jumpstarting Communities Through Tokens. And she's sort of like taking an opposite position of like, you should be using tokens to start growing your audience and to jumpstart your community. But she's talking specifically from the perspective of a creator and not like a protocol or a DAO, like what you're talking about. Would you agree with her like overarching thesis when it applies to creators, or would you still stand by what you just said?
So I haven't read the article, so I'm taking this with like general idea grain of salt. I still would apply my line of thinking to that, because I think the most important thing is fundamentals, right? Like if you want to be a viral content creator, a great content creator, and reach an amazing audience, start by nailing your content, start by nailing your brand, start by nailing your distribution channels. And then when you have that leverage behind you of the community and of a strong reputation in the space, once there's momentum, you launch a token, and that token can do, 100 times more for you, both short term and long term, than it could if you launched it into really just, something you were still developing. I also think this sort of is also a theme in DAOs. So DAOs, I always say, like, one of my principles for DAO building is community needs to come before the DAO. Like if you're building a DAO and you're trying to find the community to fit it, I've never seen that work, quite frankly. Versus if you have a community, a strong community that wants a DAO and where, their goals would be achieved more efficiently through a DAO structure, that's when a DAO structure can really efficiently implement.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'll have to send the article to you and see what you think.
Yeah, I want to read it.
Yeah,
I might change my mind after.
I'll send it to you and we'll chat more about that. But the second question I have for you is, if you could wave a magic wand and any Web3 app, tool, or protocol would immediately exist, what would you want that to be?
Oh God, that's so hard. There's like so many things. I think I'm just excited for the StarkNet ecosystem to grow. I'm so bullish StarkNet. When I first started looking into zero knowledge rollups and proofs, I sort of tried to construct almost rubric for myself of like, how do I evaluate there's all these different zero knowledge proofs and rollups, and they'll have slight differences. So I tried to make like a rubric for myself of like, okay, out of like this factor, what am I looking for? This factor. And StarkNet hits on like pretty much every single one of those. They're such an impressive team. They built the Stark proof in-house. They also built a completely novel data availability solution called Volition, which allows users to choose whether they store their data on or off chain with every transaction. So they're really pioneers in the space, and we haven't seen other zero knowledge rollups be able to really build in-house that much, which I think is super bullish for them. But also, I think they're killing it on the community side. Like, I'm so impressed by them and have so much conviction because of that. Like, there's so many devs, so many projects building on StarkNet, and they've attracted an amazing ecosystem. And like I said before, community is not something you can buy. So we're seeing other projects and protocols, right? Like Polygon, for example, has made a huge rebranding push to get into the ZK space. But all of their ZK products and sort of their spray and like paint approach has actually been either acquired by someone else or they've brought in someone to work on it, and then that person eventually leaves. So it's like, how can this roadmap be sustainable? Also, like, they don't have a focus on one specific kind of type of roll-up the way that StarkNet does, which is, I guess, like a personal preference, but they're killing it on the BD side, right? So like, they're doing all these like insane partnerships, and we'll see what happens. But I still think you can't buy community. It's the hardest thing to cultivate, and it's sticky as fuck. It's a extremely valuable moat. So if I could wave a magic wand, what I would like to see is the StarkNet ecosystem way more developed. I think there's so many projects that have so much potential, and all they're waiting for is like the network and the ecosystem of other StarkNet projects to basically be ready. And so I think it's sort of a chicken and the egg problem, but I'm really excited about what's happening in that space. And if you're building on StarkNet and you're listening to this, hit me up.
That's good to know. I first heard about StarkNet like probably a year and a half ago when I was still working at another project, and they were looking at using StarkNet to level up, and ended up going with Polygon just because StarkNet didn't feel quite ready yet. But I think, still like in theory bullish on StarkNet. They just took a little longer to get there than like Polygon, for instance. But it's sounding like over the long term, StarkNet will probably win out because they just have a better product.
I think it also depends on the use case, right? Like, we're seeing a lot of different use cases for Polygon versus StarkNet. Like, Polygon is going in for the kill with partnering with Starbucks, partnering with kind of Web2 brands. I want to say Coca-Cola, but I could be wrong. Some Web3 brands and more, but StarkNet is really like building up its own ecosystem. So I see the StarkNet ecosystem more as like not leveraging other products to gain traction, but rather like going back to that theme of like building from the ground up. But I think they could have different use cases. I also think like the StarkNet team has done a great job of working to solicit and listen and address user feedback that they've gotten. Like a big user feedback point has been about Cairo, the coding language, which is like a lot of devs have to like learn it from the beginning. And so that was a big conversation like 6 months ago, and they're actively working to make it more user friendly. But I also think if they lean into some of the principles of Boys Club about building in public, learning in community, they could make the Cairo dev space skyrocket. I'm just like thinking of like, I want to bring back those like parties that people used to throw where they're just like at their computers, like a million computers, and just like you're in a weird like basement den with like a bunch of like weird guys and like you're just like on your computer, like hackathon vibes. We need that, but like for StarkNet, and we can make it really fun and really cool and make it a whole like culty, like Burning Man experience. Go so many ways. But like make it fun, make it learn in community. And like then by having all those devs that are there for the same reason, united by the same reason, working together, talking to each other, going through this intense and, you know, maybe like strife kind of high pressure situation together, that's where you're going to find your future teammates, your future founders, your future investors, your future best friend, your future like husband or wife. So it's super exciting. And yeah, I have a lot of ideas for StarkNet. And I'm really excited for where they're going, and I feel proud of them, even though like I'm not like personally connected, but I'm like so bullish on StarkNet.
Is StarkNet and Boys Club the partnership we never knew we needed? Is that what you're saying?
That would be kind of crazy. I mean, like StarkNet already powers Snapshot X, I think, which we might use, but I'd love to see some novel voting mechanisms and governance mechanism protocols built on StarkNet. I think that'd be super cool.
Very cool. Okay, next question. Speaking of Boys Club, if Boys Club were a famous person or animal or character from history or pop culture, who would it be?
That is a hard one. That feels like a high pressure question. It could be like we talk about Boys Club a lot as like a universe and kind of a solar system of like many different projects interconnected with one another. So like from a concept point of view, it could be a solar system, but I was also sort of thinking about Reddit and its like deep sub-communities. There's Boys Club and there's like a lot of sub-communities, and actually recently a fork of Boys Club, Let's Fucking Go, got introduced to the world.
No way. What's it called?
Boys Club Singapore. They were like, hey, we love Boys Club and we want to bring it to Singapore. Can we like basically like do a fork of Boys Club? And we're like, fuck yeah. So like that's super exciting. Like in my dream world for Boys Club, we have like a million forks.
That's super cool. Have you watched Toy Story? Boys Club could be forky. Just
it could be
get
forky.
all these forks at Boys Club. Yeah. Okay. Last two questions. These are non-crypto, like personal questions to you. The first one is, if money were no issue, so like if you knew that you were financially set for the rest of your life, what would you be doing with your life?
That's a great question. Hopefully what I'm doing now. I actually love my job. Like I really like love it. Like I wake up like excited to go to work and excited to do my work every day. If money were no issue, there are other things I'd like to do though. I mean, I'd like to do some biohacking things.
Are you talking about Neuralink, or do you have other biohacks in mind?
Well, okay. So basically like Neuralink is like my number one. Like Neuralink is like, I'm so excited about it. I'm also kind of scared of it. There's a lot of other ones that I've thought about. So I actually like found this guy online called Matt Condon, one of the many Matts. He's done this project and is doing this project where he has a chip like implemented in his hand and dispenses NFTs through it. And I like lost my shit when I found this project, because I was like, holy shit, it's biohacking. It's like brain machine interface. It's like wearable tech and crypto. And it's like the first time I've ever seen anyone approach this in this space. So like I took him to the coffee shop. I sat him down. We had this super insane discussion about like how might this be regulated in the future? What does this mean for like, is this sort of going to be like tattoos where like parents are like, oh, you can't get that until you're 18 and stuff like that. But also like, what are the threat factors this introduces for cybersecurity, biosecurity? But he introduced to me during that conversation a bunch of different mechanisms that I had no idea existed. So like his friend is an electrical engineer, has like magnets in her fingertips so she can sense when there's electricity. I've thought a lot about like my like chip or my thing and like what I wanted to do. I think mainly like unlocking doors is like what I would optimize for at first, just kind of like simple MVP, like low hanging fruit. But yeah, like being able to unlock like hotel doors, like any door with that like magnet thing on it, I think that'd be useful and add a lot of utility to life.
So interesting. I can't say I've really thought much about this, but now you've got me down another rabbit hole that I'm probably going to spend a lot of time on and get back to you and be like, Parker, why'd you do this to me? And have like a bunch of questions for you too.
Let's go. Definitely read Nick Bostrom's essays.
Oh, yeah. I'll have to check that out. And then last question, if you could live anywhere in the world, where would you live?
That's also like a hard one. Kind of like, okay, so like I definitely know the answer though. I would live in Berlin. I love Berlin. It's my favorite city in the world. It's such a unique and interesting city, obviously because of its recent and rich history and everything that happened there, but also for the same reason that it's such a new city, right? So when I first went there in 2019, I was there for the 31st Fall of the Wall. Like the city in 2019 was only 31 years old, which is fucking crazy. And it's so cool to see like city development, the cultural development, architecture development, right? In this experimental space. But it's also so vibrant. It's such a fluid place. People are very like progressive there and sort of how they approach just like identity and like, and different things that I think are more stigmatized in American life. And then also the techno is fire, like absolute fire. The one thing I'd say is most underrated are the parks. They actually have like special protections from the German government and they're so beautiful. They have like rose gardens in them, sculpture gardens, but I couldn't live there forever. I'd want to move back to New York eventually. But yeah, it'd be between New York and Berlin for me.
Feel like that's been the answer for a lot of people on the podcast.
Really?
So
Are you serious?
Yeah, so you would have so many built-in friends if you actually were to move to Berlin, and all these other people that said they would want to live in Berlin also move to Berlin. I feel like it's becoming like one of the most popular crypto cities. But Parker, I've taken up enough of your time. Before you go, just tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you. Go ahead and plug away all the relevant things.
Yeah, thanks. So if you want to follow me, I'm super active on Twitter and I love the internet. I met some of my best friends through Twitter. You can follow me at Parker. So ParkerJayp at ParkerJP. That's also my Instagram, but I don't really use that. And then for Boys Club on Twitter, we are at Boys Club Crypto. On Instagram, I believe we are boysclub.eth. And if you're a founder looking to get in touch, building something new or thinking about building something new, I would love to chat with you. You can DM me on Twitter. That is the best way to get in touch. And yeah, I'm super excited to have come on. And like, I really appreciate, Diana, your nomination and your prep work for this episode. Like I said before, like I'm completely and utterly impressed with both your intellect and also the kind of like narrative design that I saw, like when you sent over some of the first bullet points and your deep research. So you're absolutely killing it. I've been on, my handful of pods and the way that you approach just communicating about the podcast, preparing for it, getting me involved, it's extremely impressive and definitely a level of excellence, I'd say much higher than average. So keep doing what you're doing. Bullish AF. I'm so excited for you too. So thanks so much for having me. It's an absolute honor.
Thank you, Parker. That is the nicest thing that anybody has said to me on the podcast. So thank you so much. That's so sweet of you. Thank you again for taking the time to come on and share all your wisdom with our listeners. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in as always. And we'll be back again next Thursday with a new episode of Rehash.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. The guest in this episode, Parker, was nominated by Diana Chen and voted onto the podcast by Diana Chen, Natasha Hoskins, Bajresh, and other anonymous DAO members. Rehash is hosted by Diana Chen, produced and edited by Ellie Dots and Tyler Internet, sponsored by Lens, Avenue, and Govern, and as always, supported by Rehash DAO. To stay up to date on all things Rehash, you can follow us on Twitter at RehashWeb3, on Lens at rehash.lens, and join our Discord to get involved.